So this lecture is based on two of the other main components of 300, which is, the tradition of Greek storytelling, Greek mythology, and also, structure. And structure is the way, when you're talking about a comic book or a poem or a short story, it's the way a story is laid out. And one of the things that makes 300 more than just a simple comic book is it has an extremely complex structure, and that it uses a lot of the traditions of Greek storytelling. I mean, we have the tragic flaw of hubris that brings down Xerxes' army. We have, I guess you wouldn't call it a flaw with Leonidas, but, he is so noble that he sacrifices himself and his 300 men for a victory. He's supposed to be descended from Hercules, or you might know it as Hercules. And so there's a lot of elements of, Greek mythology in here. Epic battles, descriptions of armies and weapons and arms. An element of the supernatural, which is kind of hinted at in this. Great battles. Usually in Greek storytelling, you have a trip into the underworld. In this case, we don't. We have a trip up into the mountains to see the Ephors. But right now, what I want to focus on is, the structure. And what you're going to find out is this is a story within a story that has stories told within the two main stories, and which sounds really confusing, so let me explain it. Okay, so basically we start off in the present tense with Leonidas and his 300 going to war. Then at the end of the book, you find out that Dilios, the guy with one eye, who's played by the guy in the movie that is Faramir in Lord of the Rings, he is actually, this is like 10 years later, and he's actually telling this story to the Spartan army and the Greek army that's about to crush the Persians for once and for all. And so already we start off and we think we're in a story, but we're actually within a story being told. All right, so it starts off with what we think is a present tense story, and it's in present tense. We march. The soldiers are marching, Stumblius falls down, gets beaten up, for falling down, and then we get our first story within a story. And the first story within a story is the story of the boy and the wolf, which we've already discussed the colors of and everything. And we already discussed that the wolf represents Xerxes and the Persian army. But what's interesting about this story is that it's a metaphor for the entire situation. Leonidas is leading the Persians into this narrow place in Greece where he's going to be able to fight them. And this story actually appears again at the end as well. And, so we basically get the story of Leonidas, a young boy, fighting this dire wolf and killing it. And, while he's, out in his final stage of his military training at about 11 or 12 years old. Okay? And so that's our first story within a story. Then we drop back about a year ago after the story of the wolf, and we find out how this whole situation got started. So now our story within a story is going from when Leonidas was 11 years old to about, a year ago when Leonidas is about 50. And that's when Leonidas kills, the Greek messengers. Then the story within a story jumps forward about, about 51 weeks, a little less than a year, and we get the story of how Leonidas goes to the Ephors to get their blessing to go to war. All right, so we get that story. And then, it jumps forward to the next morning to when Spartan and Leonidas and the Spartans are leaving. Right? Okay? Right. So we move forward. They're now on the march, and we're now back in what we think is the present tense story. So, we get the storm, where the storm wipes out the fleet, and then we're in chapter 3 called Glory. And we get our first mini story within what we believe is the present tense story of going to fight the Persians. And these mini stories are always interesting. They give you a little background, or sometimes they relate to what's going on. In this case, we get both. We get the background of how any Spartan baby that's weakly or sickly or deformed gets thrown out and tossed. So we get a little background on why the Spartans are, so genetically badass. It's like, survival of the fittest. And it also relates to Ephialtes. And generally, bad guys in Greek mythology are deformed and disfigured. Kind of like in the story of Perseus, you had the king that killed his mother was struck by lightning and deformed. But anyways, so we get a little background story on how Spartans are chosen. All right. Then we move forward a little bit to the first time the Persians send an emissary to the Spartans, where they're building a wall made out of bodies. And during that part, Dilios again is telling a story. And in this story, he is talking about the idea of duty. And he's talking about an old man who went to the Olympics, which is thousands of years old, and nobody would stand up for him to give him a seat, as any gentleman, should do. And it's only when he approaches the Spartan delegation does every single Spartan stand up all at once to offer him his seat. And the point of the story is that only Spartans, everybody knows what they're supposed to do, but it's only the Spartans that act upon it and do it. And it's also a metaphor for this. Like, all the Spartan army should be fighting this war, but because you got a handful of politicians and the E4s that are screwing it up, it's these Spartans here that are standing up and doing what should be done. Right? So now we get Ephialtes' story next. So we got several stories within a story going on, and it's his kind of background history on how his parents didn't throw him out as a baby, and it leads almost to the downfall of Sparta because of it. All right, so we move forward to chapter 4, combat. And we're fighting. We get to the fight with the immortals. We're fighting. All right, we're still fighting, and we get to chapter 5, victory. We're still fighting. And in chapter 5, victory, it's after the section Second Night, we get again another story within a story, which is relevant to what's going on. And it's the history of the first time that the Persian army came a couple of decades prior to attack the Spartans. And they landed, and then the Spartans and the Arcadians and the Greeks just kind of whooped up on them as soon as they hit the ground, as soon as they landed on the beach. And this story foreshadows the end victory that the Spartans are going to have, like 10 years after Leonidas dies, in the final battle against the Persians. So it functions to foreshadow what's to come. So again, we're fighting. Leonidas sacrifices himself. And, Leonidas is about to sacrifice himself, and we drop back into the metaphorical story of the boy and the wolf, because this is what's going on with the two armies, Leonidas and Xerxes, the Spartans and the Persians. Right? So Leonidas sacrifices himself and his 300. They die, and then we come out to one of the final pages. And we find out that this whole thing that we thought has been a present tense story is actually being told 10 years later, after Leonidas has died. And Dilios is leading the Spartan army, which is now 10,000 Spartans and 30,000 Greek soldiers, against 120,000 Persians. And historically, and in terms of the comic, they whoop up on them. And then we get our final pages where the GNC runs with blood of Persians, and it's over. And so, you have a story within a story, and then stories within that story. There's not very many works of literature that are that complex.